Do Aussies deserve digital downloads with their Blu-rays? And what can the history of computing tell us about things to come? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel. Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and this week we're doing things slightly differently. First up, I'll be talking to Choice Magazine's Roz Page about Disney's decision to scrap digital downloads on Blu-ray movies in Australia. Then Alex Kidman is chatting to Robert Dowell, a guide at the UK's National Museum of Computing. First, let's talk movies with Roz. This week we're joined by Roz Page from Choice Australia to talk about what's happening with Disney's decision to scrap digital downloads with Blu-ray movies in Australia. Roz, welcome to Vertical Hold.
Hi Adam, great to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. It's great to have someone from Choice who really understands these issues. And what we're seeing here, obviously, is that Disney has decided in its ultimate wisdom that Australians don't need free iTunes or Google Play copies of movies that they buy on Blu-ray anymore, because there's so many other ways to get those movies. Apparently Americans are still entitled to it, but we're not. Does that sound like a good deal for Australians?
Yeah, look, it's really disappointing to hear about this. Australian consumers being denied access to this service that they've had previously, it's a backward step, really.
And the fact that Americans have it and we don't, even though they have access to more services than we do, is what particularly frustrating for me, and that Disney are trying to tell us that we don't need it anymore.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of get your head around that one. I mean, we're always arguing that Australians need access to more services or to, say, the full catalogue. When Netflix launched here in Australia, that was one of the criticisms. And so a lot of those streaming platforms have been trying to address that. And, we understand that there's content deals that they've got that are in place, and that when those come up for renegotiation, they can add in Australia and try and build up that catalogue. So this really looks like a backward step in denying Australian consumers something that they've had when they've legitimately bought a movie on disc.
And the copyright laws in Australia say that it's not okay to go and copy that disc yourself, even though you own it. That's right?
Yeah, look, I mean, antiquated really is the only way to describe those. I mean, if you've got a VHS tape, you can format shift it to a digital format. But if you've got something on disc in a digital format, you can't legally format shift that to a video file, and that it really beggars belief, doesn't it, and that consumers can't legally do that.
So you're telling me if I could find Doctor Strange on VHS or Beta, I'd be okay? I could then rip it the old-fashioned way?
Yeah, pretty much. If you could actually find a working
if you still had the gear
VCR,
that would do it.
Yeah, that's right. Those copyright laws are just so far behind what most consumers are already doing.
And for a long time, it was even illegal to rip music in Australia, even after iPods were on sale here and everyone was doing it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's always been that problem where they have copy protection. So in bypassing that copy protection, you're running up against the copyright law there as well, in addition to the restrictions around format shifting.
So I think sort of Netflix has been a bit of a mixed blessing when it comes to these issues. In a lot of ways, it has made content easier to access. Do you think what are the broader trends we're seeing in Australia in terms of access to content? Is it getting better or is it getting worse?
I guess you'd have to say with the streaming, it's getting better. I mean, for a long time, we know we really only had pay TV, and that was obviously expensive. It tried to lock consumers into bundles where they just had to take a lot of shows and things that they didn't necessarily want. And so people were obviously focused on Netflix because it had the sort of market share and the mind share, I guess. And so since then, we've got like local players like Stan, and just recently we've had Amazon Prime Video. So it's good to see that consumers have got a number of different streaming platforms to choose from, and they're all sort of $9 to about $14, depending on whether it's SD or HD or how many connections you have. And that's really shown that people have a great appetite for watching movies and TV in a way that suits them, but at a fair price as well.
And what sort of impact do you think that's had on piracy in Australia?
Well, look, I think it's really helped to reduce piracy because that content is just easier to get in many circumstances, and there's always that frustration element where people turn to piracy because they can't find the content that they want, or they don't see that it's available at a price that's fair. They've got to take out, say, a Foxtel subscription if they want to watch, one season of Game of Thrones, for example, and people just sort of weigh up the hip pocket fare factor, and it just doesn't play out. Whereas with those streaming services, they're cheaper, and they're also not locked in for a year or 2 years in some cases, and that seems like a fair deal for consumers, and it gives them that flexibility. We know that streaming on smartphones has really taken off, and you just look around you on the bus or the train, everyone's watching things, and so they can use it in different devices in different circumstances, and it passes the hip pocket test.
Yeah. So the streaming services in Australia have started to introduce offline viewing modes. So you've got a movie that you want to watch on Netflix, but you're going to be on the plane, you download it to your phone or your tablet, kind of in the way that you might have used one of these digital copies in the past. Do you think that's enough to justify not putting digital copies on Blu-rays anymore?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's enough to justify it. I think the download offline viewing is it's a good development in streaming, and again, it's talking to that sort of part of people's life where they want to plan ahead for their movies, or maybe they know there's going to be internet congestion, and so they want to plan for that. But I don't think that it's going to make up for what we've been talking about today with this Disney service closing down.
From my experience also with those digital download services, there are limits on you can have one show but not another, or you can have it for a certain amount of time, so you can't necessarily be sure that it will be on your device when you want it. Unlike if you'd bought the Blu-ray copy, got the iTunes download, put it on your phone, you know it will be there.
Yeah, that's right. Both sort of scenarios have their own restrictions. We're still... there's still that sense of trying to lock people into certain platforms or certain devices, or a certain number of times they can watch it, or a certain time period. There's still that anxiety around kind of freeing the digital file, which seems kind of crazy when a lot of people know they can just, unfortunately just turn to those BitTorrent sites and it's a free-for-all. There's a real kind of conflict between those two sort of worldviews.
And do you think people who were expecting to get a digital download with their copy of Doctor Strange on Blu-ray will now happily go and buy that movie again in digital just so they can watch it on their mobile devices?
I wouldn't imagine that anyone who's just purchased that is going to be happy to front up and purchase it again. And look, perhaps there's an argument around what refund may need to be offered if someone's gone into the store with the belief that in buying that disc they were going to have access to a digital copy, that it wasn't wasn't what they thought they were getting. I don't know for people who've got pre-existing access if that's still going to be available, or if they're going to kind of none of that will be available any longer.
From what I've seen, it's still working at the moment because I went through my library. I've got a copy of Ant-Man on Blu-ray that's got a code on it. And I put the code on and it still works. So thankfully, if you've got an old disc, but even those codes have expiry dates on them. If you look at the small print on the back, and I think the iTunes one didn't expire until 2020, but the Google Play one expired in a couple of months. So there will come a time when those old codes are no longer usable, and if you're not going to get them with the new movies.
Yeah, that's pretty raw, isn't it? You've sort of bought your disc and you feel as though you've bought sort of two copies, and then suddenly going forward that other second digital copy is no longer available. Yeah, people will be pretty angry about that, and rightly so, really.
And what sort of advice do you have for consumers who are looking for the most flexible way to access their content and watch it on different devices?
Well, we always advise people to try streaming and to go for a free trial. When those streaming platforms first started, they'd offer a 4-week free trial. I think some of them have whittled it down to about 2 weeks, and some of them ask you to register your credit card, so you've then got to go in and remember to cancel it if you don't want to get into an ongoing subscription. But definitely try before you buy, because even when you just go on their website, you can sort of get a sense of some of the shows they've got, but they're going to show you their sort of, top line brand new shows, like it's Better Call Saul on Stan, for example, or Transparent on Amazon Prime. But it's kind of the catalogue that you want to know about. You want to dig a little deeper and find out, maybe you're a Seinfeld fan and you want to find out who's got Seinfeld or Sex and the City or something like that. So having that free trial give you the chance to dig a little deeper and find out what movies they've got and what they've got in their back catalogue.
Perfect. That sounds like some really great advice. Ros, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Adam. My pleasure.
Next up, we'll hear from Alex, who's talking to Robert Dow from the UK's National Museum of Computing, which is located near Bletchley Park, where Alan Turing and others helped break the German encryption codes during the Second World War.
I am a guide at the National Museum of Computing and have been since 2012. My fascination for this place is because of the sort of disconnected links, and I take a lot of my inspiration from James Burke. James Burke is a TV presenter, and during the 70s and 80s he did a variety of TV shows called Connections, The Day the Universe Changed. And he looked at history not as a series of events that happen because one thing leads to another, but because of serendipitous meetings within that time. There, people would say, I am doing this, and they go, my God, that's just what I'm looking for, and they'd go and do that. Or they would see something that influenced them because not of what it was, but what it did. And that would then lead them to a eureka moment. And all of these items he linked in by saying, these 3 items have a link somewhere in the past, and I'll tell you about it now, and it would be a 45-minute show. So when I look at the Computer Museum, it's largely the same thing. What effectively you're dealing with is the Colossus is created, and that leads to the Mosaic, which is the Ministry of Supply's computer. But there's no direct link, but we know it is because it was created just after the war and built in 1952. They had 13 of them. But back in the 50s, you didn't just make a machine in an afternoon. It took you years, especially 13 of them. And these links in history, as we go through, and what the museum has, both archive material and machines, is my driving force for being here.
Absolute devil's advocate question. I've certainly got my own perspective on this, but technology obviously moves forward very rapidly. Why is the history important, especially for, perhaps not so much for Colossus and the era where everything was Official Secrets Act, but for the more recent kind of 70s to now history, in your view?
I'll give you 2 answers. The first is a very short one, and the second one's slightly longer. The first is based on, if you don't know where you've come from, how do you know where you're going? So in order to understand these links of what we have today, you can't look at the technology. That's like looking at a Betamax VHS video cassette recorders and saying, why did one win and one lose? It was a social reason. So Betamax lost because it couldn't do 3 hours or 4 hours on long play. And that dictated in a large market like America why VHS became the predominant standard. It wasn't as good quality, but then for watching reruns of your latest football match, who cares? So that's why it won. The same applies to computing technology. You get kids in today who would look at their phone and consider it a phone. You go, nah, it's a computer. They argue with you until finally you get to the point of saying, this runs apps. Show me your home landline running apps. Show me your computer running apps. So the differentiation between what we consider a computer and what we don't is primarily linked to how we view the past. So the slightly longer answer is that when you look at how people have created things, especially when we have the education tours, you end up invariably with people who assume that their phone just appeared one day under the pillow, like the tooth fairy comes along and gives them a pound coin because their tooth fell out. And unfortunately, it couldn't be further from the truth. You can take disparate items like the LCD display sitting over there. The technology for that starts in 1888. And if you look at Frederick Renitzer's work back in 1888, where he talked to Otto Lehrman, you find out that there's this connection between 2 people that leads to a technology that for 70 years no one actually has a use for. Which I find it strange that they had 100 experts in the world in 1960 who had a conference about this technology no one knows what to do with. And how can you be an expert on something no one knows what to do with? It's very, very strange. But put that aside. the history helps us understand the fundamental aspects of why computing is such a draw. If you look back in the 50s, you didn't get near this thing. You tended to book time on something, and you would hand your problem over and the problem would get solved. So looking at the decade markers is one area where we can see this dramatic and absolutely revolutionary change, and potentially see the direction of travel. If we are to see the 1940s, there are no personal computers, there are no computers, they're people. A computer is a term for a person. In 1935 to 38, the Webster's Dictionary started to include the possibility that it would be an automated machine. So this is where we see this fundamental change. By 1950, we have a single-digit quantity of computers, meaning that there are more inside my mobile phone than there were in the world in 1950. But by 1960, you have one in a town. So now we're seeing a personalisation of this technology. It's becoming more prevalent. And until the 70s, it's not really close, because in the 70s, you'd maybe be the only person in your street with a computer. In the 80s, the only person in your house with a computer. In the 90s, the only person in your room with a computer. And by 2000, you're walking around with a phone. 2010 is how many devices have we got on us? And 2020 is going to be, where are they? Are they in you? Cochlear implants, optic nerve replacements, pacemakers, etc. So to understand a subject and not forget the foundations, because otherwise you end up with a top-heavy situation where there's too many people who understand the basic rudimentary functionality, but when it all comes crashing down, they don't know what to do. You look back in the past and see why people progressed. I mean, look at The Witch. Why did anyone say, yeah, okay, great, wonderful, let's have a faster one? Because it still didn't have anything that drew people, that today's understanding, towards the technology.
For anyone listening who's suddenly panicking about witches, can you give like a 30-second explainer?
Okay. Witch was built in 1949 to 51. It was Harwell's computer, and it stands for the Wolverhampton Instrument for Teaching Computation from Harwell. It got that name in 1957-58. Prior to that, it was one of the very early generation of computers. And from a standpoint, if everyone wants to see that in Australia, then go to Melbourne and look in their museum, and they've got a very large first-generation machine. It's from 1949.
Right. I was at the museum here probably, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it was just being fixed up or finalised to work at that point.
2012, we had it sort of partially working. 2013, it was working, but they were ironing out the bugs. So because a 60-year hiatus between build and restore is going to have a few areas. And even now they find weird things. I mean, 3 years ago they found a dry joint that had been there since 1951. Or 1950 when the power supply was made. So that's pretty good for a dry joint to have worked all this time. But the Witch is a remarkable machine because it's dodged all the silver bullets that all the others haven't. The one in Australia, for instance, has a turn-off date in 1964. It would be wonderful to see it working again, but it's the cost of bringing these things back to the working land, because otherwise you turn them on, they catch fire. That's the big problem. And also they may burn down, and what's more important, having the artefact or trying to get something working? So in our sense with the Witch, we're lucky because it's such a simple structure. It's very easy to get at. And there's no buried wiring deep inside the machine because it's just racks of machines. And to a large degree, it's very similar to the Hollerith Heck, which is another first-generation computer.
Right. The Colossus is probably the star turn in terms of getting people in the door, but obviously the museum is a lot more than that. You cover off everything from kind of punch cards to school education through your BBC Micro Room to women in IT, which is a very hot button topic at the moment. Is there that broad intent to have as wide a span of technologies and processes in play, or is it just has it evolved that way?
It's evolved. That's the safest way of putting it. These machines, you don't go looking for them per se. You may say, oh, what have they got here? We know they have something. And you get them. Other people donate machines, so it's more of a serendipitous accident that this thing happens, and you say, oh, that looks interesting. And as the museum evolved, it gets to a point where the evolution as run by the volunteers doesn't run into how everyone else does it. So there's this growing pains. as people decide what gallery does what. And obviously with limited space, which you can't go bolting extras onto a 1944 building without drawing attention to someone. We have to be intelligent about how we use the space. Obviously, as you said, with the education side, using the old BBC micros from 1982, is one that probably won't change anytime soon, unless you can find some facility that can be off-site or something like that. I don't know. But from the museum's aspect of the Colossus came back because it's its home. So where it sits is where the Ninth One's at. From there, the building was kind of requisitioned, and they put things in it, which kind of made it hard to get things out. And the idea of the Computer Museum kind of started about 2005. Tony Sale at the time wanted to expand into British Computing, an offshoot of CCS and the BCS, to have another area, because his interest in old computers, there are on YouTube, for instance, you can see him operating the Pegasus, which is a 1950s first generation machine. And his passion drove what we have here. Since he's passed away 2011, we've had quite a lot of change as people have brought in new ideas. But obviously with something like the ICL 2966, it's not going to move anytime soon, because it's several tons of equipment and it's very delicate. And I think the worst thing is they've just got it working again. And if you move an old mainframe that's working, you've got months of commissioning time. So the way things are at the moment is probably quite set, apart from some of the other galleries, which they are thinking on, a couple of the galleries, refresh and redo and other bits and pieces. But it's an evolution, and because of a lack of funds, like any museum, you have a limited quantity of funds and you have to use it intelligently. So there's a limit to where we go and what we do. But it'll change slowly and it'll evolve more. But I think it'll evolve with a more controlled direction than somebody, as it used to be, set up there was a gallery which has now got the Nats in it, and they just keep putting machines in and shuffling them around and making the odd thing work. So there's more of a controlled evolution now.
I've got to admit, having done some of my own schooling in the UK in the late 80s, the room full of BBC micros is kind of warmly nostalgic and terrifying in equal measure.
You're probably expecting a teacher to come around the corner to get ready for this exercise.
Yeah. Just curious as to what kind of, even just loosely, what kind of percentage of people you get coming for that kind of nostalgic hit of, oh, I remember that thing, or I remember that thing, or as opposed to that more general interest in technology, geeky side, or just, or the education focus?
I think it's an offshoot. I think the majority of people who come to the museum usually look at these items as the Colossus, and then they float into the rest when the museum's open and they see these things. And you get the people who worked in the 50s and 60s, they go, oh wow, I remember that, the Elliott 803, we had that just in 1960. Or somebody says, I worked on that. Or the other day we had a guy come in and he says, I actually built the memory upgrade for the Elliott 903. He now is on the education program. But it's that leads on to other things, and then you get the mid-generation, my age of between 35 and 49, who look at this technology as something we used the first time round, and it's both apprehension and excitement at the same time. And you tend to look at the BBC micros and you either have an abject hatred of them because you think, why did they ever use 0 as the first number, or because that was your first machine, and obviously there's always a love affair with those. And that era was very strange, because in the early 80s there were so many variations. You could play the bun fight and legitimately get away with it. You could say, mine does this and my dad's bigger than your dad. The aspect of computing today is you say, well, my Android phone is just like everyone else's. There's no individuality, and it's the same with everything. So I think that now we've become data agnostic. I can take my iPad artwork and I can put it on an Android or my PC or my Mac. It becomes largely irrelevant. So the kind of dogmatic religious wars between the Mac and the PC is sort of, whatever.
We did this with Commodore's Spectrums, Amstrads,
Atari ST and Amiga and all that. I've been through this warfare that we see people throwing buns at each other. And I think we've got to a point now which is interesting, that combined with those who turn up and look at the museum, you also have those who say, how the hell did you do anything on this? Because their expanse of options is now so great, with the internet being this transport mechanism, and all the technology allows you to go from one end to the other and still see the same thing. You couldn't do that on a Commodore 64 and a VIC-20. I want to send you a picture. Yeah, how are you going to send it? You've got to describe on what you're going to do first. Take longer than sending it. So I think in terms of what happens is people come here and then they just get sucked through, and that's when all their memories wake up. They go in the PC gallery and it's, my God, I used to carry a Toshiba T5200 or something.
Now, obviously, as a museum, and you mentioned before, funding is always a challenge, and the Colossus tour that I've just done, there was mention made of needing valves to keep that going because they're no longer produced. I have no idea if the Australian valve standard would work or not, but anyone listening, if you have valves you don't need, contact the National Computer Museum.
Yeah, on our website we've got a list of the valves that are used. I mean, they're relatively common because it's radio valves that are after in Colossus. On the other subjects of the other bits in the museum and the donations, we get sponsors who sponsor the place. The Colossus has a supply of valves. One of the overlooked ones is the Witch, or the Harwell Decatron, has specific requirements for trigger tubes, which are not necessarily valves, and they have to be paired. So you can't just stick two in and hope. They're paired together. And I don't know if we've got a limitless supply of those, but the Decatrons are the same ones they had in 1951. So those things just don't seem to die. You just have to reseal the Bakelite mount. But on the subject of those elements, there are a diminishing pool of bits. But on the subject of valves, there is a company that wants to buy all the old valve making equipment and start up valve for production again, because there's so much enthusiasm for warmer electronics and amplifiers, or in old electronics people want to play around because we've got the luxury of building a digital circuit. I want to see what the real one's like. So there is that thing going on now. I saw somebody talk about it the other day.
Valves aside, is there anything in computing history, I guess it's British computing history especially, that being a focus, that the museum doesn't have that you'd like to get?
Oh, difficult to say. I mean, I deal with the Apple kit, which is a bit of an anathema to British computing, because even though Apple were over here very early in their existence, it's not British. So I'd say an Apple One, if anyone, and not the original Apple One, or if anyone wants to donate it, great. But you're dealing with, I think the last one went for $250,000, and there was another one for 1.5 million euros or something, because it had Steve Jobs' signature on it. But somebody made a replica of an Apple One circuit board. So I think if it's very early electronics, things like the Heathcliff, or you had the Selby H8 or Heathkits and other things, you've got these elements that are early, but nothing to my mind really sticks out that we're after thing, unless it's an early British computer, because there weren't that many of them. ZX80, Sinclair ZX80 for instance, we have about 5 of those. Once you go past a certain point, you think, are we collecting just because it's old, or are we collecting because it's unique, or are we just collecting because we're hoarders?
Yeah. There's got to be that function to it. Yeah.
It's probably more finance to help with storage, because we have a big storage facility that we've had knocked a wall through and built another one, and they're constantly organising it. So I think the problem is lack of space in both storage and here at the museum, and so we're now becoming a lot more selective about what we take. But I don't think they'll ever say no to the radio valves they need because of the diminishing pool of thing. And it'll always be old radio operators whose their parents have passed away, the father was the radio operator, and in the loft they've got, I don't know, 60 valves or something, which ironically nowadays almost probably have as much value as they did back then. 5 shillings back then in this country, and now they're worth 70 quid. And you think, well, actually that's about the same price, inflation adjusted.
They've held their value.
Maybe old components. If you take, for instance, some of the old CPUs, some of the old memory chips like the 4116s, the 2116s and so on. These are by definition used in the Apple IIs, the Commodore 64s, the PETs, and the first thing in the PET to go is the memory. So I'd say probably more likely components.
Okay.
And some of the older, more obscure CPUs, because again, they don't take much space, and they are rare because most people chuck them out of the system.
Well, on the Apple front, Steve Wozniak is apparently becoming an Australian citizen, but whether or not I can shake an Apple One out of him, I don't want to promise anything.
It's not even that. I'd love to meet the guy. I mean, he's such a radical person that what he did is he didn't build it to earn money, he built it because he wanted one. I think that was so funny. And he likes technology for what it is, but a recent interview, he was becoming quite jaded with Apple, not in the sense of what they do, but what they're not doing. Not taking risks and designing something interesting. just because you can. It's the reiteration of the iPads and iPhones, and it's safe territory. And during the 80s, they used to take these weird offshoots, Pippin, the game console, or the Lisa, which was off left field, never made money, and they buried 5,000 of these things in some secret landfill somewhere. That's it.
The G4 Cube or something like that.
We've got a G4 Cube. We don't have a keyboard with it. We don't have a mouse. So we got the machine, no power supply. We'd like we'd like a power supply for our G4 Cube and a screen to go with it, one of the LCDs. So there are odd things that we'd like, but generally speaking, it's difficult to say at the moment because the database is so big. The store is still being organised and is filling up rapidly. And that's the problem with computing. It's so diverse.
Awesome. That covers everything I wanted to discuss with you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And that just about wraps it up for this episode of Vertical Hold. Got any thoughts about what we've discussed? Drop us a line via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Alcatel.